She hit the snow hard, her horse already gone, and somewhere behind her, a lantern swung between the trees. She pushed herself up. Her left ankle screamed. Then she saw it a faint orange glow through the pines. A window, a fire, a chance. She walked toward it, because there was nothing else left to walk toward. The door opened. A man with dark hair gone gray at the sides looked her dead in the eyes, his voice flat and unreadable. "Name's Rowan Hale. This is my home. You're safe tonight." Tonight. One woman, 3 men, and a winter that could take everything. Read on. The storm hit hard after sundown. Eliza Moore had been riding for 6 hours when her horse lost its footing on the ice. 1 second she was leaning forward, urging the animal faster. The next, the ground came up to meet her and knocked every thought from her head. She lay still for a moment, snow pressing against her cheek, cold working into her coat. Her left ankle throbbed. She tested it, pushing herself up onto her hands and knees. It held her weight, barely, but she could feel something was wrong the moment she stood. Behind her, somewhere down the slope, a lantern swung between the trees. Victor's men. She grabbed her horse's reins. The mare pulled back, spooked, and yanked free. Eliza watched her disappear into the dark and did not waste time calling after her. She turned and walked because running was already beyond her. The snow came sideways. Wind shoved at her shoulders, like a hand trying to turn her around, send her back down the mountain toward the men with the lantern. She kept moving. She had no idea where she was going. She only knew she had to get somewhere that wasn't here. Then she saw it, a faint orange glow between the tree trunks. Not a lantern. Something steadier. A window, maybe. A fire. She made it 20 more steps before her ankle gave out completely, and the snowdrift swallowed her. She didn't hear the dog first. She felt its warm breath on her face, something wet pressing against her temple. Then a bark, sharp and close, and then voices. "Here. Over here. She's over here." Hands reached into the snow. More than one pair. They were careful, which surprised her. She had expected to be grabbed. "Can you hear me?" "Open your eyes." She tried. The wind was still screaming. There were 3 of them standing around her, and one of them had looped a rope around his waist that connected to the others. "She's breathing," someone said. "Her foot's wrong." A different voice, lower. "Calm. Let's get her inside before we lose her." They carried her. 2 of them took her arms, and the third stayed close on her other side. One hand braced against her back. She was too cold to feel much. She registered warmth eventually, the shift from wind to stillness, wood smoke, the sound of a door shutting against the storm. They set her down near a fire. She blinked until the room came into focus. A main room, wide and plain. A dog sat a few feet away watching her with its tail moving slowly. 3 men were crouched or standing around her, each one waiting. Tallest one spoke first. He had dark hair going gray at the sides, and a face that looked like it had spent 30 years arguing with the weather. "I'm Rowan Hale. This is my home." He kept his voice flat, not unkind. "That's Tom. That's Silas." Tom was younger, with an open face and a small cut above his eyebrow. He raised one hand when his name was said. Silas was older than Tom and quieter than both. He was already looking at her ankle. "Can you tell me your name?" Rowan asked. "Eliza." Her voice came out, cracked. "Eliza Moore. Eliza." He nodded once. "You're safe right now. Nobody's getting up that trail in this weather." She wanted to believe him. She didn't yet. Silas moved closer. "Your boot is frozen to your foot. I need to cut it away and look at the ankle. That's the first thing." He paused and looked at her directly. "I won't do it without telling you what I'm doing before I do it. All right?" She looked at him. He had steady hands and steady eyes, and he was waiting for an answer. "All right," she said. Tom was already moving. She heard water being poured, something heavy shifting near the fire. He was heating stones, she realized. Heating blankets. Silas pulled out a short knife and held it up so she could see it. "Just the boot. I'm going to start at the lace and work down. Tell me if anything gets worse." The leather was stiff as wood. He worked slowly. When the boot finally came free, the pain hit her all at once, and she sucked in a sharp breath and closed her eyes. Stay with me, Rowan said. He had moved closer without her noticing. His voice was different now, less flat, more deliberate. Tell me something. You got a horse? She ran. What color was she? Brown, nearly black in the dark. We'll look for her when the storm breaks. He kept talking. Simple questions, nothing that required much thought. What direction had she come from? How long had she been riding? Whether she had eaten? She answered each one without opening her eyes. She understood what he was doing and let him do it. Silas cleaned the wound. The pain was bad enough that her hands curled into fists, and she heard herself say it before she thought about it. Just make it quick, she whispered. Silas's hands didn't stop, but he said, almost done. You're doing fine. Tom appeared at her other side and pressed a folded blanket, warm from the fire, gently against her shoulders. He didn't say anything. He just made sure she felt it. She was still shaking 20 minutes later. Silas had wrapped her ankle and moved back. Stones Tom had heated were wrapped in cloth and placed around her feet. The fire was close. She had 2 blankets over her, and still her whole body shook. Her temperature's down, Silas said quietly. It wasn't really directed at her. What do we do? Tom asked. We warm her, carefully. They did it without discussion, and without making her feel like a problem to be solved. Tom sat on her left, close enough that his warmth reached her through the blankets. Silas took her right. Rowan stayed near her feet, adding wood to the fire in steady intervals. None of them pressed against her. None of them touched her without reason. They simply stayed. An hour passed. Maybe more. The shaking slowed. She started to think again somewhere around the second hour. Thoughts came back in order. The way they do after cold releases its grip. She remembered the lantern in the trees. She remembered why she was on the mountain in the first place. She turned her head and found Rowan watching the door. There's a man, she said. Victor Kane. He's looking for me. None of the 3 men moved. He runs a logging camp below the mountain, she continued. He wants me to marry him. I won't. He was going to force me. Tom's jaw tightened. Silas looked at the fire. Rowan looked at her. How many men with him? At least 6, maybe more. She paused. He won't stop. He needs something from me, and he can't get it without my agreement. He'll come up here. Rowan was quiet for a moment. He can try. I don't want to bring danger to your house. It's your house too right now. Rowan said it simply. Like it wasn't a generous thing to say. Like it was just a fact. You're injured. The storm is still going. Nobody's making any decisions tonight except to keep you warm. She looked at him for a moment. Then at Tom, who had his arms rested on his knees, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then Silas, who had turned from the fire and met her eyes with something that looked like recognition, like a man who had once been in a bad situation himself and knew what it felt like to sit in someone else's warm room and not trust it yet. She didn't trust it yet either, but she was warm for the first time in hours, and the 3 strangers around her had not done a single thing she hadn't asked for. That was enough, for now. Her eyes grew heavy. She let them close. Somewhere outside, far below, a horse's hoofbeats broke through the sound of the wind. Then a voice, loud enough to carry up the slope and through the walls of the lodge. Eliza Moore, Victor Kane wants his runaway bride. Returned. She opened her eyes. Rowan was already standing. The voice outside called out twice more, before going quiet. Rowan crossed the room in 4 steps and stopped with his back against the front door. He didn't reach for his rifle. He just stood there, one hand flat against the wood, listening. Tom hadn't moved from his spot beside Eliza. His eyes were on Rowan. Silas picked up a lamp from the shelf and turned it down low. After a minute, Rowan spoke through the door. Calm, unhurried, loud enough to carry through the wind. Woman inside is injured. She can't travel in this weather. Come back when the storm breaks. A pause. Then the voice outside said, she's a runaway. She stole money from Victor Kane and fled before the wedding. We're authorized to bring her back. You're authorized to freeze to death on my porch, Rowan said. I told you when she can travel. That's all I'm telling you. Another pause, longer this time. Eliza had pushed herself upright against the wall. Her ankle ached, but she kept her eyes on the door and her breathing even. "She'll be returned to Mr. Kane," the voice said, "alive and unharmed. He's a reasonable man. There'll be payment for your trouble." Rowan turned and looked at Eliza. His expression asked the question without words. She shook her head. He turned back to the door. "Offers declined. Road's icy. I'd head down slow if I were you." Footsteps on the porch? Then nothing. Then after a long moment, the sound of horses moving away through the snow. Tom let out a breath. "Well, they'll be back." "Yes," Rowan said. He pulled a chair from beside the fire and sat elbows on his knees. He looked at Eliza. "Now you tell us the real story." She told them everything. Her mother had passed 2 years ago and left her a modest sum in a Helena bank. The will required Eliza to be either 28 years old or legally married before she could access the full amount. She was 26. Victor Kane had learned about the inheritance through a clerk he'd paid for information. He ran a logging camp and a freight operation below the mountain, and from the outside, everything looked profitable. Eliza had figured out the truth after he started pushing for a quick marriage, before she'd even agreed to walk out with him properly. His business was nearly bankrupt. He owed wages he'd never paid. He needed her money to cover it. "He can't just take it," she said. "He needs me to sign the papers and say in front of witnesses that I'm doing it willingly. 2 witnesses, spoken consent. That's what the documents require. He can't forge all of it." Silas had been listening from across the room with his arms folded. "So he needs you alive and agreeable." "That's why his men didn't fire at the door," Tom said. "He also needs the trail," Rowan said. "This approach is narrow. If something happened to Eliza during an assault, he'd have nothing." He looked at her again. "He'll wait. He'll try to pressure instead of rush." Eliza nodded. She'd thought the same thing. It was almost the only thing working in her favor. Silas unfolded his arms and stood up straight. He had a way of doing that when he was about to say something important, not dramatic, just deliberate. "We need to talk about how this house runs," he said, "since we're all going to be inside it together." Tom raised his eyebrows slightly but didn't object. "3 rules," Silas said. "First, nobody forces another person to do anything. Not here. Not in this house." He looked at Eliza directly when he said it, and she understood he was including himself and the other 2 men in that statement. "Second, nobody leaves alone during a storm. Too easy to die out there without someone knowing where you've gone. Third, anyone physically able to help contributes. We don't carry passengers." He said it plainly, without any edge to it. It wasn't a threat. It was just how the house worked. Eliza looked at all 3 of them. "I can cook. I know how to stretch supplies. I can mend clothing and care for horses." She paused work. "Then you stay," Silas said. Rowan stood and picked up a lamp. "I'll show you the room." It was small. A cot, a chest of drawers, a hook behind the door for coats, 1 window with the shutter latched against the wind, and a lock on the inside of the door, a solid one. A bolt she could throw herself. Rowan set the lamp on the dresser and pointed at the bolt. "That's yours to use or not." "Your choice," he left before she could thank him. She slid the bolt across anyway. Not because she was afraid of them. She just hadn't slept somewhere she could lock the door in a long time. It felt good to do it on her own terms. In the morning, she heard Tom knock twice before he spoke through the door. "There's coffee if you want it." "No rush." She sat on the edge of the cot for a moment. Her ankle was wrapped tight and stiff. She found a walking stick leaning against the wall that hadn't been there the night before. Silas, she guessed, without asking whether she needed it. She unbolted the door and went out to find them. The main room was brighter in daylight. A big table, a stone fireplace, shelves along one wall with books and tools mixed together. Tom handed her a tin cup without ceremony. Rowan was at the window, watching the tree line. Silas was in the kitchen, moving quietly. Eliza wrapped both hands around the cup. "I want to explain something," she said. "About the money. About why I ran when I did." Rowan turned from the window. "Victor told his workers I stole the wages he owed them. That's how he explains where the money went. If I go back to town, some of those men will believe him. She looked down at the cup. I'm not just running from a man who wants to marry me. I'm running from a story he built around me. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he framed you. He's working on it. Rowan came away from the window. His face didn't change much, but something in his posture shifted. You should have said that last night. I was trying not to pass out last night. Tom laughed. It was short and surprised out of him, but it was genuine. Even Rowan's expression moved slightly. Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway. Breakfast is ready. They sat at the table and ate. It was simple food, salt pork and cold cornbread, and nobody said much. But nobody said nothing either. Tom asked how her ankle felt. Silas told her to keep her weight off it another 2 days. Rowan refilled her cup without being asked. Eliza thought about Victor's men at the bottom of the trail. She thought about the road that was still buried in snow. She looked around the table. 3 men who had carried her out of a blizzard. 3 men who had sat beside her through the night without asking for anything back. She still didn't trust it fully. That was honest. Trust took time, and it took evidence. And she'd only been here a matter of hours. She wasn't afraid. That was different. After breakfast, Tom went out to check the fence line. He came back 20 minutes later with snow on his boots and a look on his face that was trying to stay neutral. He held up his hand. His fingers were stained red. Paint, he said, on the post beside the north fence. Fresh. Rowan stepped forward to look. Victor's men use it, Tom said. A red mark on a tree or a post means they've located someone they're tracking. The room went quiet. Rowan pulled on his coat and went outside without a word. Eliza followed him to the doorway and watched from the threshold. He crossed to the fence in long strides, crouched beside the marked post, and pressed 2 fingers against the wood. He stayed like that for a moment. Then he stood and turned back toward the house, and she could read the answer on his face before he said anything. The paint was still wet. 4 days passed. The storm eased on the 2nd day and returned harder on the 3rd. By the 4th morning, the wind had finally dropped, and the mountains sat under 2 feet of new snow, with a sky so white it was difficult to tell where the clouds ended and the ground began. Eliza's ankle held her weight now. She didn't need the walking stick if she moved carefully. She was not the kind of person who could sit still when there was work in front of her, and there was always work in front of her. She started in the supply room. The shelves were organized the way men organize things when they have a system that works for them and have never needed to explain it to anyone else. She didn't rearrange it to be difficult. She rearranged it because she found 2 sacks of flour pushed against the back wall where the cold came through the foundation. And both of them were damp. She brought them out and checked them carefully. Most of it was still good. She spread the flour on a clean cloth near the fire to dry and went back to take inventory of what remained. When Tom appeared in the doorway and saw her on her knees counting sacks, he stopped and leaned against the frame. You don't have to do that. I know, she said. Do you know how long this needs to last? He thought about it. Could be weeks, if the road stays bad. Then you're short on salt, and you have more dried beans than you think. They got pushed to the back. She looked up. You also have a small barrel of oats that's perfectly fine, but it's sitting under a leaking seam in the roof. Somebody should move it. Tom looked at the ceiling, then back at her. I'll move it. Today. He did. She portioned the supplies into what they needed weekly and what could be stretched if the mountain stayed cut off longer than expected. It wasn't complicated. It was just paying attention and doing the arithmetic. At midday, she made a simple meal from the pantry dried beans, cooked down with salt pork, cornbread from the last of the good flour, and coffee that she made stronger than they usually did because the day was cold and everyone was tired of the cold. Silas came in from outside and stopped when he smelled it. You didn't have to cook, he said. The rule is that anyone able to help contributes, she said. I'm able. He sat down and didn't argue. Rowan ate without comment, but he ate 2 full portions, which she decided to take as its own kind of answer. In the afternoon, Tom dropped his coat on the bench by the door, and Eliza saw the state of it. The left sleeve was half torn away, and the lining had come loose along the collar. He'd been going out in it every morning to check the fence and the trail below. She didn't say anything. She just picked it up when he went back outside and found the sewing kit she'd asked Silas for on her second day. It took her an hour. The sleeve was the harder part. The fabric had pulled away from the seam rather than torn clean. So she had to work it back in sections. When she finished, she cut the remaining scrap of lining fabric and set it aside. Tom came back inside, rubbing his hands together, and she handed him his coat. He put it on and stopped, ran his hand along the sleeve, looked at the collar. "You fixed it." "It was cold to look at," she said. He examined the small square of leftover fabric she'd set on the bench. He picked it up and tucked it into his front pocket. "That's mine now," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Finest piece of cloth in this house," he said, very seriously. "I'm keeping it." She laughed. She hadn't laughed in days, and it came out louder than she expected. That evening, she went to Silas's workroom to return his sewing kit. He was at his bench, organizing a small wooden cabinet with a dozen little drawers. Medicine, she realized. Herbs, bandage cloth, a few small bottles. "Can I help?" she asked. He showed her what went where. She cut new bandages from a length of clean cloth he had set aside, folding them even and tight the way he showed her. They worked without talking much, and it was comfortable. After a while, he said, "My wife used to do this, cut the bandages." Eliza was quiet. She didn't reach for something to fill the silence. "Her name was Clara," he said. "My daughter was 5. There was an epidemic." He kept his hands moving while he talked, fitting small bottles into their slots. "That was 11 years ago." "I'm sorry," Eliza said. She meant it simply, without anything else attached to it. He nodded once. "I'm still practicing, caring for people," he said. "It's harder than it sounds after something like that." She understood what he meant. He wasn't asking for pity. He was just explaining himself. The same way she'd explained herself to Rowan 2 nights ago. "You're good at it," she said, "caring for people." Even when it's hard, he didn't answer, but he handed her the next length of cloth to fold. In the morning, she went to the stable. One of the mares had stopped eating. Eliza noticed it, because she'd been the one to bring the feed that morning, and the horse stood at the back of her stall, with her ears down and her weight shifted wrong. She went in slowly and ran her hand down the animal's leg. The horse tensed. Eliza worked her way to the hoof, picked it up, and leaned close to look. There a small nail driven up into the soft part of the hoof. Not deep enough to be serious, but enough to hurt with every step. She went and found Rowan. He came to the stable and looked at what she'd found. Then he moved to the horse's head and took her halter, talking quietly to keep her still. The mare was nervous. She stamped and pulled, but Rowan held her steady without any roughness, just patience and a low, even voice. Eliza worked the nail free carefully. The horse shuddered once, and then settled. Eliza cleaned the small wound and packed it. When they came out of the stall, Rowan looked at her for a moment. He had an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Thoughtful, reconsidering something. He didn't say it outright, but she felt the shift. He'd been watching her all week: the flower, the coat, the medicine cabinet, and now this. She hadn't tried to impress anyone. She'd just done what needed doing. Later, while she was washing her hands at the basin outside, Tom came and leaned against the stable wall. "Rowan's brother used to play fiddle," he said. "Every night, almost. This place was loud then. Good loud." He looked up at the roof. "After he died, Rowan put the fiddle in the attic. Said he didn't want to hear it." He was quiet for a moment. "That was 3 years ago. House has been pretty quiet since." Eliza dried her hands. She thought about the name of the place, Silent Lodge. "What happened to his brother?" she asked. "Blizzard," Tom said. "Rowan chose the route. He's never stopped blaming himself for it." She didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say about a grief like that from the outside. She was still thinking about it that afternoon, when Tom came through the back door fast, his face tight. "Come look at this," he said. She followed him to the stable. One of the horses they'd left in the outer paddock had returned alone. Its saddle was empty. There was an arrow, driven straight through the leather, pinned there deliberately, with a small roll of paper tied to the shaft. Rowan was already there. He pulled the paper loose and unrolled it. He read it once, then he held it out so they could all see. The letters were large and uneven, written in a hurry or by someone who wanted them readable from a distance. "Hand her over before the snow stops." The snow stopped on the 6th day, not all at once. It thinned through the morning, then quit around noon, and by mid-afternoon, the sky had gone pale and bright. The kind of quiet that follows a long storm always felt fragile, like it could break again without much warning. Eliza had grown up in Montana. She knew better than to trust a clear sky in winter. Rowan knew it too. He spent the morning on the porch watching the trail below. Tom checked the fence line twice. Silas restocked the medical cabinet without being asked. Nobody said they were preparing. They just were. Victor arrived 2 hours after the snow stopped. 6 men came up the trail on horseback, spread wide enough to look like a show of force without being close enough to cause trouble yet. Victor rode at the front. Eliza saw him from the window before she heard him, and that was enough time to get her breathing steady. He was not what people expected when they imagined a dangerous man. He was neatly dressed even on a mountain trail in winter. He sat his horse well. He had a calm face and careful eyes, and if you didn't know him, you might think he was reasonable. She knew him. Rowan stepped out onto the porch alone. Tom moved to the left window. Silas stood near the right side of the room, close enough to the door that he could reach it fast if needed. Eliza stayed back from the window, but kept it in her sightline. Mr. Hale Victor's voice carried easily across the clearing, friendly, almost warm. "I appreciate your patience with this situation. I know it's been an inconvenience." "Hasn't been an inconvenience," Rowan said. Victor smiled. "I'm glad to hear it. I've come for my fiancée. I think there's been a misunderstanding, and I'd like to clear it up." Eliza was frightened. She made a decision in a difficult moment. "I don't hold that against her." Rowan said nothing. Victor continued. "She's going to lose her inheritance if she doesn't complete the necessary paperwork before her birthday. I'm trying to protect her interests. I've brought the documents with me today." He glanced at 2 of his men, who were carrying a wooden box between them. "2 witnesses, everything prepared. We can settle this quickly and get her somewhere warm and safe." Eliza pressed her back against the wall beside the window. "She'll also lose access to the money her mother intended for her," Victor added. "That would be a shame. I'd hate to see that happen because of a misunderstanding." Rowan's voice came back flat and even. "She told me a different version of the inheritance rules." A pause. Victor's expression didn't change. "She may have been confused." She didn't seem confused. Victor looked at the house for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope. "I'm prepared to offer you compensation for your trouble, Mr. Hale. A fair sum for sheltering her. No hard feelings. I won't answer for her," Rowan said. That stopped Victor. Rowan turned his head toward the door. He raised his voice just enough to reach her. "Eliza, do you want to go with him?" She pushed the window open 2 inches. She looked at Victor. He was watching the window now. His expression was still calm, still reasonable, but his hands had tightened on the reins. "No," she said clearly. The word went out across the clearing and sat there. Victor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, the warmth had thinned out of his voice. "You're making a mistake. I've been patient with you. That patience has limits. So does her answer," Rowan said. Victor looked at his men, then back at the house. "I want you to understand what happens if you continue interfering in a legal arrangement. I can have the mountain road blocked before the next storm. Your supply runs, your freight, your access to town, all of it stops until this is resolved." "We've already resupplied," Rowan said. "I can also make sure certain food stores below the mountain are unavailable to this household." Tom's voice came from inside, through the open window, calm and unhurried. We've got a full cellar. Victor's jaw moved. He looked at the house with the expression of a man recalculating. Silas appeared in the doorway behind Rowan. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, which was its own kind of statement. You can't protect her forever, Victor said. We don't need forever, Rowan said. We just need today. Victor held his position for another minute. He was looking at the narrow trail, at the angle of the lodge, at the 6 men he'd brought, and the math that told him an assault wouldn't work cleanly. He needed Eliza unharmed. He needed her willing. A gunfight on a mountain trail in poor visibility, neither. He turned his horse. We'll be close, he said. It wasn't a threat exactly. It was just information. The 6 men followed him back down the trail. Rowan came inside and closed the door. Eliza was already sitting at the table. Her hands were folded in front of her, and they were perfectly still, which had taken some effort. He'll try to starve us out, she said. He can try, Tom said. I want to leave. She looked at Rowan. Not because I want to go with him. Because staying here puts all of you in danger. That's not something I asked for when you pulled me out of the snow. Rowan sat down across from her. You didn't put us in danger. He did, by coming up here. That's a generous reading of it. It's the accurate one. He looked at her steadily. And you can't leave today. The trail's covered, and your ankle isn't fully healed. So the decision isn't actually available to you right now, which makes it easier. She looked at him. You can't make decisions for me. I'm not. I'm giving you information. The decision will be yours when you can actually make it safely. He paused. Different. She thought about that. He wasn't wrong, which was irritating. Tom had gone to the window. He was quiet for a moment, then said, There's someone still in the trees. Rowan joined him. They both stood looking out at the tree line, south of the lodge. Victor left a man watching, Rowan said. Eliza came to the window, too. At first, she saw nothing. Then she caught it, the slight dark shape between 2 pines, not moving. Just settled there, like it planned to stay. That night, the food shed caught fire. Eliza smelled it first. She was still awake, sitting near the main room window with a blanket over her shoulders. And the smell came in around the door frame, not wood smoke from the fireplace. Something sharper, with the smell of stored grain underneath it. She called out before she was fully on her feet. All 3 men were moving within seconds. Rowan grabbed the water pail from the kitchen. Silas went for the second one by the back door. Tom pulled on his coat and boots and went out first. Eliza helped carry water, back and forth between the shed and the well, which was harder than it sounded when the ground was ice. The fire hadn't reached the main food stores, yet whoever started it had gotten the corner of the shed where they kept the extra firewood. They stopped it before it spread. When it was out, they stood in the dark and cold and caught their breath. Rowan looked at the scorch marks, at the ground near the shed. At the tree line, Tom wasn't there. Eliza looked around. She'd seen him a moment ago near the fence. Silas looked too. Neither of them spoke immediately. Then from the dark, somewhere beyond the north fence, there was movement in the trees. A scuffle, then silence. Tom did not come back. They found the blood at first light. A dark trail of it, starting at the fence post and heading north into the trees. Not dragged, the footprints were upright, uneven, someone moving fast and hurt, but moving on their own. Rowan crouched over the prints and read them the way he'd read snow his whole life. He went in himself, Rowan said. He wasn't carried. Someone hit him first, Silas said. He was looking at the place near the fence, where the snow was disturbed, churned up, 2 sets of boot prints that had gotten close together fast. Eliza had come out with them. She stood a few feet back and looked at the trail leading into the trees. Victor uses old freight buildings out here, she said, scattered along the old logging trails. He stores tools in them, sometimes supplies. If Tom was hurt and needed shelter fast, he'd look for a roof. Both men looked at her. I saw the maps in Victor's office once, she said. He showed me the operation when he was still being polite about things. There's an abandoned shack about a mile north of this fence. Maybe a mile and a half. Rowan stood. You're staying here? No, she said. I'm not going to shoot anyone, I know that. And you know that. But I can carry blankets, and I can help Silas when he needs a second pair of hands. Rowan looked at her. You left me at the lodge and something happened anyway, she said. Tom was out there because of the fire. The fire started because of me. I'm going. It wasn't a long argument. Rowan looked at Silas, who had already turned back toward the house to get his medical bag. They moved out 20 minutes later, all three of them. The trail north was hard going. The snow was thigh-deep off the path, and the cold had a bite that got into the lungs and stayed there. Eliza kept pace. Her ankle ached, but it held. She carried a rolled blanket under each arm and kept her eyes on the ground in front of her. They found Tom in the abandoned shack. He'd made it to the door and gotten it open, and gotten himself inside, and then run out of whatever had been keeping him upright. He was on the floor against the far wall, his shoulder packed with cloth he'd cut from his own shirt, his face the color of old ash. Silas was beside him before the door had stopped swinging. Shoulder, Tom said. His voice was rough. Ezra came out of nowhere when I followed him into the trees. I got the worst of it. You walked a mile with a bullet in your shoulder, Silas said, already cutting away the makeshift bandage. Mile and a half, Tom said. He tried to smile. It came out crooked. Eliza knelt and pressed one of the blankets against his side, below the wound, to get some warmth back into him. Silas worked quickly and without wasted motion. Rowan stood near the door watching the tree line. The bullet had to come out. Silas did it efficiently, with Tom's hand gripping the floorboards and Eliza holding the lamp steady so Silas could see. When it was done, Tom sat very still for a long moment, with his eyes closed. Then he opened them and looked at Eliza. You didn't have to come, he said. The rule is nobody leaves alone, she said. It applies in both directions. He was quiet. Then, in a voice low enough that Rowan might not have caught it from the doorway, I always figure I'm going to get left, whenever I'm not useful anymore. Eliza kept her hand where it was, flat against the blanket on his good side. You belong to this household, she said. That's not something that changes when you get hurt. He looked at her for a moment, then away, like the words needed a second to find the right place to land. Silas tied off the bandage and sat back. He caught Eliza's eye and held it for a moment. She saw something in his face tenderness, the kind a man carries carefully when he's learned the cost of losing people, and then he looked back at Tom. Near the door, something on the floor caught Rowan's eye. He crouched, a small book dropped in the rush, half covered by snow that had blown in under the doorframe. He picked it up and opened it. It was an account book, columns of names and numbers, pages of them. He turned through, slowly, stopped, turned back. These are wages, he said. Workers' names and what they earned. He moved to the next section. And here's what Victor says they owe him. Rent on their housing. Food from his store. Debs he invented. Eliza came to look. She recognized the format. Victor had shown her the operation carefully, back when he'd been trying to impress her. Tom raised his head. He was still pale, but his eyes were focused. Let me see the names. Rowan brought the book over and held it where Tom could read without sitting up. Tom went through slowly, his finger moving down the page. I know some of these men, he said. Good workers. Been at the camp for years. He stopped. His finger held on a line near the bottom. Look at this. Rowan leaned in. There was a note in the margin. Victor's handwriting, tight and deliberate. Tell men more woman took the missing wages. Confirm story with Ezra before town run. Eliza read it twice. He told them I stole it, she said. He turned men who have nothing against me so they'd help him bring me back. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Rowan turned to the last page of the book. He read it once, then held it toward the light so they could all see. At the bottom of the final page, in the same tight handwriting, attack Silent Lodge on the full moon 2 nights. They brought Tom back to the lodge that afternoon. It took time. He could walk. Barely, with Rowan on one side and his good hand braced on Eliza's shoulder. Silas stayed close behind, watching the trail and Tom's color in equal measure. By the time they got inside and got him onto his cot, Tom was gray and sweating, and he fell asleep before anyone had finished pulling off his boots. Silas sat with him through the night. Eliza stayed up too, not in Tom's room, but near the fire, close enough to hear if Silas called out. She didn't sleep much. She sat and thought about 2 nights and a full moon and the note in Victor's handwriting. Rowan found her there at dawn. He poured himself coffee and stood by the fire, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Silas came out of Tom's room and closed the door quietly behind him. "Fever broke," he said. "He needs rest, and he needs to keep the arm still, but he'll be all right." Eliza let out a slow breath. Silas looked at her. "You should sleep later," she said. He nodded and went to pour his own coffee, and the three of them stood there in the early light without talking, which was its own kind of relief after the night they'd had. 2 hours later, Silas said there was a way out. He'd been thinking about it while he sat with Tom. The northern trail, the smaller one that came out behind the old ridge, had a different exposure than the main road. Less wind, different drainage. He'd gone out at first light to check it. "It's passable," he said. "Narrow and slow, but passable. A careful rider could reach the stagecoach station before nightfall." He said it plainly. No particular emphasis. Just information. Rowan set down his cup. He went to the back room and came out with a canvas pack. He spent 10 minutes filling it without saying much. Food, a wool blanket. The folded bills he kept in a tin on the shelf. He set it on the table and looked at Eliza. "There's a horse in the stable that can handle the northern trail," he said. "She's sure-footed. You take her." He paused. "You don't owe us anything. Not for the rescue, not for the food, not for any of it. We chose to help you. That was our decision, not a debt we put on your account." Eliza looked at the pack. "The stagecoach runs 3 days a week," Rowan continued. "If you leave in the next hour, you'll make the afternoon run. You can be in Helena by tomorrow evening. The bank, your inheritance, all of it that's yours to deal with on your own terms." She didn't say anything yet. Tom was awake. She could hear him shifting in his room. The quiet sounds of a man trying not to let on that he was listening. She didn't call out to him. Silas sat down across from her at the table. He rested his hands flat on the wood. "Choose the future that belongs to you," he said. "That's all, whatever that looks like." She sat there with the pack in front of her and thought about it honestly. The safe answer was obvious. Take the horse, take the road, get to Helena, get to the bank, sort out her inheritance with a lawyer, and be done with Victor Kane through legal channels rather than through a mountain siege. That was the logical path. Anyone looking at it from the outside would say she'd be foolish not to take it. She thought about Victor, about the way he operated. He'd burned the food shed. He'd shot Tom through the shoulder. He'd left a man in the trees for days to watch their movements. If she left now, he would still be here on this mountain with 3 men who had sheltered her, and he would know it. Leaving didn't make Silent Lodge safe. It just meant she wouldn't be here to see what he did to it afterward. She also thought about something else. She thought about what she actually wanted, which was a question she hadn't been able to ask herself freely in a long time. She went outside. She stood in the cold for a while, looking at the northern trail, a thin line, through the snow heading up and over the ridge, and away from all of this, she could see where it was passable. Silas was right. A careful rider, a good horse, 1 hour's head start. She stood there and let herself make the choice without anyone watching. Then she went back inside. She left the pack on the table. She went to the supply room and took inventory of what they had. She came back and started portioning it out, what they needed for 2 days, what could be held in reserve, what should be kept accessible versus stored. Rowan watched her from across the room. "I'm staying," she said, without stopping what she was doing, "not because I owe you, because leaving doesn't actually fix the problem, and I'd rather be here when it gets fixed." She looked up briefly, "And because I want to be. That's the part that matters." She filled every water container they had. She laid out bandage cloth in clean rows where Silas could reach it fast. She moved the remaining horses to the back section of the stable, where the walls were thickest. She worked steadily and without rushing, and the men let her work. At some point, Tom appeared in his doorway, his arm in a sling Silas had made from a flour sack. He watched her for a moment. "Lodge started feeling like a home again after you came," he said. "I don't know when it happened exactly, but it did." She looked at him. He meant it. That was clear. "Go lie back down," she said. "You're going to pull that shoulder." He went. But he was smiling when he did. Later in the day, Silas found her alone in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke, like he was deciding whether to say it at all. "I'm afraid of this," he said, "of caring about someone. I know how it ends sometimes." She turned to look at him. "Clara and my daughter, after I lost them, I decided I could work and be useful, and that would be enough." He looked at his hands. "Then you showed up in a snowdrift, and apparently I was wrong." She didn't try to give him an easy answer. Easy answers were for people who hadn't actually lost anything. "Being afraid of it doesn't make it less real," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." That evening, after supper, Rowan found her in the main room. He sat in the chair across from her and was quiet for a long moment. The fire was low. Outside, the sky was going dark. "I want you to stay," he said finally. "I've wanted it since about the second day, and I've been pretending I didn't." He looked at the fire, not at her. "But I won't use that to hold you. Not the rescue, not this house, not any of it. If you stay, it has to be because you chose to, not because you felt you had no other option." "I know," she said. "That's why I stayed." He looked at her then. She held his gaze. "I had the option. The pack's still on the table. I saw the trail. I made the choice." He nodded slowly. Something in his face that had been held tight for days eased slightly. She didn't call it love yet. She wasn't sure any of them were quite there in words, though she thought they were all getting close to the same place from different directions. What she knew was that she cared about each of these men, the particular shape of each of them, their different ways of being in the world, and that caring felt like her own, chosen freely, not borrowed from gratitude or fear. That was enough for tonight. That night, she woke to a sound from the stable. She lay still and listened. It was faint, not loud enough to be an intruder trying to be heard, but wrong somehow, out of rhythm. In the morning they found it. The reins in the stable had been cut. Clean cuts, a sharp knife, deliberate. And there, in the corner of the stable floor, clear in the dust and scattered straw, boot prints leading to the back wall, to the place where the woodshed attached, to the hidden passage underneath it. Rowan crouched beside the prints. Silas stood at the back wall and looked at the seam where the entrance was disguised. "Ezra," Tom said from the doorway. He was leaning against the frame, keeping his arm still. "He found the tunnel." Rowan looked up. His jaw was set. "Then Victor knows about it," Silas said. Nobody needed to say what that meant for the full moon, now one night away. The day before the full moon was the quietest day Eliza had spent at Silent Lodge. Not peaceful quiet, the other kind, the kind that builds up pressure inside it, the way air feels before a bad storm rolls in. Everyone had something to do, and did it without much talk. Tom cleaned his rifle left-handed, slowly, because his shoulder wouldn't allow him the other way. Silas checked the tunnel entrance and reinforced the latch from the inside. Eliza went through the supply room again, moving things to higher shelves, packing what was most valuable into a single chest that could be carried fast if they needed to move. Rowan spent most of the day on the porch or at the window, watching the trail, watching the tree line, watching the mountain, the way a man watches something he's not sure he can protect. At supper, nobody ate much. After supper, Rowan pushed back his chair and stood up. "I'm going down the mountain tonight," he said, "before the full moon. If I can reach Victor before he brings his men up here, I can end this on ground that's better for us." Tom put down his fork. "No," Rowan looked at him. "You're doing it again," Tom said, "deciding to carry all of it yourself and not telling anyone until you've already made up your mind." His voice wasn't angry, but it was firm. "You did the same thing with your brother." You picked the route alone, and you didn't listen to anyone who had doubts. The room went very still. Rowan's expression didn't change on the surface, but his hands had stilled on the back of his chair. Silas said it quietly. Tom's right. That habit deciding alone and moving alone, it's the same one that got your brother killed. You know that. I know the risk of staying put and waiting, Rowan said. You know half of it, Silas said. You don't know what Victor's already set in motion. Going down alone in the dark, the night before his planned attack, is exactly the kind of move that gets a man killed without anyone knowing where he went. Rowan's grip tightened on the chair. Eliza had been listening. She'd been watching his face and thinking about everything she'd learned about him in the past week, the way he stood between people and danger, the way he made decisions fast and alone, the way his love for the people around him had gotten tangled up with the belief that protecting them meant controlling everything before anything could go wrong. Protecting people doesn't mean removing their right to choose, she said. It doesn't mean making every decision so they never have to face anything hard. You know that. You told me the same thing 2 days ago. Rowan turned to look at her. You told me my decision about leaving was mine to make, she said. You said that's what respect looks like. That applies in both directions. The silence stretched. Then Rowan said, Your being here has put all of us in danger. His voice came out harder than she thought he intended. If you had gone down the North Trail when you had the chance. She stood up. She didn't raise her voice. Then say that clearly. Say you want me to leave, but don't dress it up as strategy. Tom pushed back his chair fast. Eliza. She was already moving toward the back hall. Tom stood up. He didn't cross the room to block her. He stayed where he was, but his voice stopped her at the doorway. I love you, he said. She turned. He looked like it had surprised him too a little, saying it out loud. But he didn't walk it back. I'm saying it because it's true, and I'm tired of not saying true things. His voice was steady despite his face. I found a family here, the first one that ever chose me, knowing what they were choosing. I'm not ready to lose it. He looked at her directly. I'm not asking you to stay because of how I feel. You don't owe me that, but I wanted you to know. Eliza stood in the doorway. She looked at Tom, then at Silas, who had turned toward her and was holding her gaze with an expression that cost him something. I love her too, Silas said. Low, careful like a man stepping onto ice. He isn't certain will hold. That terrifies me. Loving people and losing them is the thing I swore I was done with. He paused. Apparently, I don't get to decide that. She came back into the room. She stood in the middle of it and looked at all three of them, and she said it because it was honest and she was done with the alternative. I love Tom's warmth, she said. I've loved it since the second day, when he kept the worst jokes I've ever heard, and somehow they still made me laugh. She looked at Silas. I love your steadiness. The way you care for people like it's something you've decided to do regardless of the cost. She turned to Rowan, and I love your honesty. Even when it's difficult, even when you aim it in the wrong direction. Rowan was still standing at the chair. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he let go of the chair. I love you, he said. It came out quieter than his usual voice. I've been trying not to since about the first morning. I'm not built for pretending something isn't true. He looked at Tom and Silas. I love both of you too. That's not a new thing, but I forget to act like it when I'm scared. The four of them stood there in the firelight. Eliza spoke first. We need to talk about what this is, all of us, before anything else. They sat down, all four of them. And they talked. It took a while to say everything that needed saying. They talked about what each of them needed and what they wouldn't accept. They talked about jealousy, that it was real and that it had to be spoken, rather than used as leverage. They talked about the fact that Eliza didn't belong to any of them, that belonging to someone wasn't the thing any of them actually wanted from this. They talked about the men's own relationships with each other, three people who had been sharing a life for years and had never put language to what that meant. There were things that weren't easy to say, Tom admitted. He still feared being the one left behind. Silas said he didn't know how to stop waiting for loss to arrive. Rowan said he understood, for the first time, that the way he loved people had been hurting them, deciding for them, carrying everything, keeping the weight so heavy on his own shoulders that no one else was allowed to help. They agreed on things that mattered, that each person's choice was their own, that consent meant something and had to stay meaning something, that fear and jealousy were allowed, as long as they were discussed instead of deployed, that anyone could change their mind, that nobody was a prize or a possession or a solution to a problem. After a long time, Eliza looked at Rowan. He crossed the room and she reached up and kissed him. It was simple and it was real, and it lasted long enough to be both of those things. When she stepped back, she took Tom's hand with her right hand and Silas's with her left. Tom looked at her. "You sure about this?" "Ask me tomorrow after we've survived the night," she said. He laughed. Even Rowan's face softened. They sat together for a while after that, close to the fire. They had decided not to go further while Victor's men were a night away on the mountain. That boundary was easy to agree on. It felt right, actually choosing each other clearly first, without urgency, pushing them into anything faster than it should go. Then the window exploded inward. Glass hit the floor, and 1 second later, a rifle shot echoed up from the tree line below. Then another. Then, from the rear of the house, the unmistakable orange flicker of flames climbing the back section of the roof. Rowan was on his feet. "They moved early," Silas said. Eliza was already moving toward the water pails. The full moon was still 23 hours away. Victor hadn't waited. The bullet came through the window and hit the back wall 3 inches above the water pail. Eliza was already moving before the second shot. She grabbed the pail and pushed it toward Silas, who was heading for the back door to check the roof. The orange light climbing the rear wall wasn't subtle. It moved fast, the way fire does when someone's helped it along. "They didn't wait for the full moon," Tom said. Victor changed his mind. Rowan had his rifle up, positioned left of the broken window. Or he panicked. Either way, he's here now. 2 more shots came from the tree line below, high. Warning shots, maybe, or bad aim in the dark. Eliza didn't wait to find out which. She took the second water pail from the shelf and carried it toward the back, where smoke was already finding its way under the door. The fire had caught the rear section of the roof, the part above the woodshed, which connected to the tunnel they all knew Ezra had already found. Whoever had started it knew exactly where to stand. Silas got the back door open, and the smoke pushed in, hard. He pulled it shut again. "Roof's gone back there. We can't fight it from outside. Then we fight it from in here, as long as we can," Rowan said. They did. Tom managed the window with his good arm, watching the tree line, calling out when he saw movement. Silas and Eliza carried water to the back room, soaking the interior wall to slow the spread. It bought them time. Not much, but some. Eliza was coming back through the main room with an empty pail when Rowan turned from the window and headed toward the hallway. "What are you doing?" she said. "My brother's compass is in the back room." She stepped in front of him. Not to block him exactly, just to make him look at her. "That wall is on fire," she said. "I know where it is. I can get in and get out. The ceiling's going to come down." She looked at him steadily. "You know it is." He looked past her at the hallway. The smoke was darker now, thicker. The orange at the edges of the doorframe had turned red. "Rowan," she said his name quietly. "Your family is in this room." A long second passed. The ceiling in the back room cracked like a gunshot. Something heavy shifted and gave way, and smoke poured under the hallway door like water. Rowan didn't move toward the hall. He looked at her. Then he turned back toward the window and picked up his rifle. She let out a breath and didn't make anything of it. There wasn't time. It was Eliza who said the tunnel first. She'd been thinking about it since the fire started, running the options while she carried water. The main road was blocked. Victor had men at the bottom of the trail, and no one was getting through that way. Without a fight, they couldn't win. The front door was a kill shot waiting to happen. That left the tunnel under the woodshed. "Ezra already knows about it," Tom said. Yes, she said, but the roof over our heads is on fire. So we go through the tunnel, and we deal with Ezra on the other side. Nobody argued. There wasn't a better option, and they all knew it. They moved fast. Tom carried what he could with one arm. Silas took his medical bag, and the account book they'd brought back from the freight shack. Rowan grabbed ammunition and the food pack that Eliza had staged near the door 3 days ago. She'd put it there because she'd thought something like this might happen. She didn't say so. She just picked up her end and helped carry it. The tunnel entrance was in the floor of the woodshed, under a false layer of planking. Rowan went first, then Tom, then Silas. Eliza went last and pulled the planking back into place above her head, more out of habit than hope. The tunnel was low and dark and cold. She could hear the fire above them, a deep crackling that moved through the ground. They came out the far end into the tree line behind the house. The clearing was lit orange from the burning roof. Victor was there. He had 4 men with him, arranged in a loose line. He was watching the rear exit the way a man watches a door he knows is about to open. He looked at Eliza, and he smiled. Not warm, satisfied. "I'll give you credit," he said. "The tunnel was a good idea. I just had a better one." He took one step toward her. Tom moved, and one of Victor's men raised a pistol and pointed it at Tom's chest. Victor said, "Don't." Tom stopped. Victor looked at Eliza. "I need you to walk over here. Willingly or not, that part stopped mattering about an hour ago." "She doesn't go anywhere," Rowan said. "You're going to lower that rifle," Victor said, "because if you don't, that man shoots your friend and I make this harder on everyone." He looked at Rowan the way he looked at everything, like a debt he was collecting. "She's coming with me. That's already decided. The question is how badly tonight ends for the rest of you." Rowan's rifle didn't move. Eliza stepped forward. "Rowan," she said it clearly. "Put it down." Rowan looked at her. She held his gaze. She made sure he saw that she knew what she was doing. "Do not come alone," she said. It took him a moment. Then he lowered the rifle. Not dropped it, lowered it. Victor's man let Tom breathe again. Victor moved to Eliza's side and put his hand on her arm. She let him. She walked with him across the clearing without pulling away, and she didn't look back, and she kept her face completely still. Behind her, she heard Tom say something low and urgent to Rowan. She heard Rowan answer. She didn't hear the words, but she heard the tone, and the tone was 2 men agreeing on something, which was enough. Victor brought her down the mountain to the logging camp. It took 2 hours in the dark and cold, and he didn't speak much, which suited her. She spent the time noticing things. How many men were with them, where they positioned themselves. The layout of the camp as they rode in, which she mostly remembered from his tour months ago when he'd been trying to impress her. The office building, the payroll desk she'd seen through the open door, the large cabinet on the back wall where he kept his records. He put her in a storage room off the main building. The door was old. The hinges were original to the structure, which meant they were iron. And they were rusted, and they were set into a wood frame that had been softening for 20 years. She sat down on the floor and started testing them immediately. The window had been nailed shut. The lock was solid, but the bottom hinge had a nail that shifted when she pressed it, not much, less than a 1/4 inch, but it moved. She reached into the inside hem of her dress, where she'd kept her small sewing scissors since the second day at Silent Lodge, and she got to work. She didn't hurry. Hurrying made mistakes. She worked the nail for an hour, loosening it in the old wood, pressing and releasing, until she felt the hinge plate lift slightly on one side. Not enough to open the door. Enough to know she could. Then she stopped and waited. At some point, she heard Victor giving instructions in the next room. The wedding was set for morning. He'd arranged 2 witnesses. She heard him say her name and the word willing, and she kept her hands still in her lap and breathed evenly. He came in once before dawn. He had the marriage papers under his arm. She looked at him without any visible emotion. "I want time to change my clothes," she said, "and arrange my hair. I'll be presentable." If we're doing this, I'm not doing it, looking like I've been dragged off a mountain. He studied her. Give me an hour, she said. I'll sign the papers. I'll say what you need me to say. She kept her voice flat, practical. But I want to look like I'm doing it willingly. That's what you need, isn't it? Witnesses who believe it. He considered that for longer than she would have liked. Then he nodded and set the papers on the shelf. 1 hour. He said, there are 2 men outside this door, I know, she said. He left. She heard the lock turn. She gave it 5 minutes. Then she stood up and put her shoulder against the hinge side of the door and pushed, slow and steady, until the hinge gave and the door shifted in its frame. Not open, just loose enough. She waited, listening. When Victor came back, he opened the lock and pushed the door inward, and she was standing just inside, her expression cooperative, the papers in her hand. He reached for them. She dropped, grabbed the scissors from her hem, and cut the strap on his gun belt in one motion. The holster hit the floor. She ran. She cleared the doorway before Victor finished swearing. The yard was wide and open, workers moving between the buildings in the early light, and every one of them turned to look at her. 2 of Victor's men were 20 feet to her left. She ran right, toward the main steps of the office building, and she got there before anyone caught her, because Victor had posted his men to watch for people coming in, not for someone already inside running out. She took the steps and stopped on the top landing, high enough to be seen, loud enough to be heard. My name is Eliza Moore, she said. The yard went quiet. She recognized the moment. Victor was behind her, coming fast. His men were moving. She had about 30 seconds. Victor Kane owes you wages, she said. Every man here who has worked this camp and been told he's in debt, that debt isn't real. He invented it. He kept your money and told you that you owed it back. Someone near the equipment shed stopped walking. I saw the account book, she said. I know how he runs it. The rent he charges for housing you didn't choose. The food prices at his store that nobody else can match. The debts that somehow never get smaller, no matter how long you work. Victor reached the bottom of the steps. She's lying, he said loud. Controlled. She's been trying to steal from this operation for months. Ask yourselves why she ran. Ask yourselves why she's here. Because he brought me here, Eliza said. At gunpoint last night. A murmur moved through the yard. Tom came through the east gate. He had the account book in his good hand. Silas was right behind him, and behind Silas came Rowan, moving in a wide arc toward the office side of the building. Tom held up the book. I've got wages in here, he said. Real wages. What each man earned, and I've got Victor's numbers next to them. You want to see the difference? Come look. 2 men walked toward him immediately. Then, 3 more, Victor said. Those records are falsified. He broke into my freight house. Your man shot me in the shoulder, Tom said cheerfully, which is an interesting way to protect legitimate business records. Silas had moved to the far side of the yard. He'd found the workers being held in the bunkhouse for invented debts, and he was talking to them quietly, gesturing toward the gate. One by one, they came out into the yard. An older man near the forge raised his hand. Kane told us he'd have our families removed from housing if we left, he said. It wasn't a question. He was just saying it in front of people, which was different. He told me the same thing, another man said. Victor's voice shifted, still controlled, but tighter. Every one of you has a contract. You break it, you pay the penalty. That's legal. That's documented. Tom looked up from the book. Show me where Eliza Moore's name appears in your payroll records, Victor. Show me the wages she was supposed to transfer. He waited, because I've read every page and her name isn't in here once. Victor looked at the crowd. He was recalculating. She could see it. He looked at Eliza on the steps. Then he moved fast. He crossed the yard and grabbed her arm, pulling her down from the landing and turning her in front of him, his hand locked around her wrist. Rowan stopped. His hand dropped from his holster. Here's what happens, Victor said. He wasn't shouting. He never shouted. She signs the papers. We conclude the legal arrangement. And then every one of you gets back to work, and this is over. He looked at Rowan. Lower it. Rowan lowered his hand. Victor's grip on her wrist was hard. She could feel the bones pressing together. She looked at Rowan's face, and she saw it the same look as the night before. He was waiting for her. She stamped down on Victor's foot with every bit of weight she had. His grip broke for half a second, which was all she needed. She drove her elbow back into his ribs and pulled free and ran to the left toward the corral fence where Victor's horses were tied. She pulled the reins of the nearest one free, then the next, then the third, working fast down the line until 6 horses were loose in the yard, ears up moving, nervous. Victor's men tried to regroup, and the horses split them in 3 directions. Tom and Silas hit Victor from both sides. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the way it happens in stories. Victor swung, connected with Tom's bad shoulder, and Tom went down to one knee and came back up again, and they got Victor on the ground, together with his arm behind him. Ezra came out of the equipment shed with a pistol raised and aimed at Tom. 3 workers tackled him from behind. The yard was loud and moving, and full of horses going in every direction, and Rowan stood in the middle of it with his hand on Victor's collar, and the fight was over. Just like that, because when the men Victor had used to hold everything in place stopped cooperating, there was nothing left to hold. Victor looked up at Rowan from the ground. "You should have taken the money I offered you," he said. "The money was Eliza's," Rowan said. Victor's jaw tightened. "My company is bankrupt. I needed that inheritance to cover the operation. I would have paid those men. Eventually. Tell the sheriff that," Rowan said. One of the workers, the older man from the forge, his name was Garrett, came and stood beside Rowan. He looked at Victor for a long moment. "He told us you stole our wages," Garrett said to Eliza. He said it without heat, just stating what had happened. "Said you had access to the payroll records and you transferred funds before you ran." "I know," she said. "We believed him." He paused. "I'm sorry for that." She looked at him. "He built it to be believed." Garrett nodded. Then he looked at Rowan. "We'll take him into town. We've got enough men and we know the trail. We've been wanting to leave this camp for 2 years. He glanced down at Victor. "This seems like the time." 2 men tied Victor's hands. 2 more dealt with Ezra, who had stopped fighting and was sitting in the dirt, looking at the ground. A young worker, barely 20. Thin coat for the temperature, was already saddling a horse. I'll ride ahead, he. Tell the sheriff what's coming." They let him go. Eliza stood in the middle of the yard and watched the camp reorganize itself without Victor at the center of it. And it was remarkable how quickly things shifted. When the person holding the pressure releases it, the thing that was pressed down doesn't stay down. It straightens up and looks around and figures out what to do next. Rowan came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "Are you hurt?" he said. She checked herself honestly. Her wrist was sore where Victor had gripped it. Her ankle had held. She was cold and tired, and her dress had a tear along the hem from the tunnel. But nothing was wrong that rest wouldn't fix. "No," she said. He nodded. Tom appeared at her other side, cradling his arm. "For the record," he said, "the part where you cut his gun belt was the best thing I've ever seen." "You weren't supposed to see it," she said. "You were supposed to already be inside the fence." "We were a little behind schedule," he said. Silas came and stood with them. He'd found a blanket somewhere, and he put it around Eliza's shoulders without asking. She pulled it closer. Garrett's men moved Victor and Ezra toward the trail. Victor didn't say anything else. He walked with his hands tied and his head up, which was the last bit of dignity available to him. And he took it. They watched until the group reached the tree line and disappeared. Then Silas said, "We should go back up the mountain." They all turned and looked at the trail leading back up toward Silent Lodge, toward where Silent Lodge had been. They smelled it before they saw it. Smoke and wet ash and cold wood. The particular smell of a fire that burned hard and then got rained on, which the sky had done sometime before dawn. The rear section of Silent Lodge was gone. The back rooms, the woodshed, the tunnel entrance, all of it had come down in the night. What remained was the main room, the kitchen, the front two bedrooms, and the porch. The walls were standing. The roof over the main room had held. Rowan stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at it for a long time. Eliza stood beside him. "You're free now," he said. His voice was quiet. "Victor's going to trial. The bank will clear his documents. Your inheritance is yours." He paused. "You don't have a reason to come back up here." She looked at the damaged lodge, at the walls still standing, at the stone fireplace visible through the open front door, completely untouched. "Go to town," he said. "Get the inheritance sorted. Open that sewing shop. You'd be good at it." He meant it genuinely, which somehow made it harder to hear. "You don't owe us a life on a mountain." She turned and looked at him. "Is that what you want?" He didn't answer fast enough to be honest, so she let it go. They went into town the next morning, all four of them, and Eliza gave her statement to the sheriff. The two witnesses Victor had brought to the logging camp had already come in on their own, both of them volunteering that Eliza had never given consent and that Victor had misrepresented the entire arrangement. Garrett and four other workers provided statements about the wages, the debts, the threats to their families. The Helena Bank sent a response within 3 days. Victor had never successfully filed any marriage documents. Every legal instrument he'd prepared was invalid. Eliza's mother's inheritance was hers, fully and without condition, as of the date of the bank's letter. She read the letter sitting at a table in the town's one decent boarding house, with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. Victor and Ezra were held in the jail. The logging camp workers had voted to continue operating under a new arrangement, collective, with Garrett running the books. They asked Eliza if she had any objection to using the camp's existing equipment and structures. She told them it had nothing to do with her. They thanked her anyway. Rowan and Tom and Silas stayed in town for 3 days. They fixed up what they needed to fix, bought supplies, spoke to the sheriff twice. Then they went back up the mountain. Eliza stayed. She spent 2 days sitting with her options. She walked around town. She looked at the empty storefront on the main street, where a sewing shop could reasonably fit. She had breakfast by herself and dinner by herself, and she sat with the quiet and asked herself honestly what she wanted, now that wanting something freely was an option. On the third morning, she hired a wagon. She loaded it with food, fabric, tools, 2 new windows in their frames, enough lumber for a back wall, and a small box of medicines she'd bought from the town pharmacist, because Silas's supply had been destroyed in the fire. She drove it up the mountain herself. When she came into the clearing, all 3 of them were outside working. Rowan was on the roof. Tom was measuring something along the back wall. Silas was on the porch, sorting salvaged materials into 2 piles, keep and discard. They all stopped when they saw the wagon. Eliza set the brake and climbed down. "I want to invest in the rebuild," she said. "Part of my inheritance. Enough to do it right." She looked at Rowan on the roof. "I want to be a legal owner of this property. Not a guest. Not someone you're sheltering. An owner." Nobody spoke for a moment. "I want that written up properly," she continued. A document. All 4 names. Rowan came down from the roof. He came and stood in front of her and looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the morning she'd chosen to stay the first time, like he was confirming something. "You're sure?" he said. "I drove a wagon up a mountain in February," she said. "I'm sure." Something in his face settled. Not relieved exactly, more like a man who has been holding tension he didn't realize he was holding, and has just been given permission to set it down. Tom grinned. He'd been trying not to, and losing. Silas walked to the wagon and looked at the lumber. He ran his hand along the top plank, checking the cut. "Good wood," he said. It was the highest compliment he offered on most things. Rowan sat down that evening and wrote the agreement out by hand. 4 names. Equal shares. Eliza Moore, Rowan Hale, Thomas Reed, Silas Ward. The property and structure of Silent Lodge, held jointly, no single person above another. All 4 of them signed it. Rowan rolled it up and put it on the shelf above the fireplace, Then he went to the corner of the main room, where the stairs to the attic were, and he climbed them. He came back down with the fiddle. It was old, and a little warped from the years in the cold attic. He sat with it for a while, turning it over, tightening the pegs slowly. He didn't say anything about his brother. He didn't need to. He took the old compass down from the shelf and mounted it on the wall near the window, where the light hit it in the morning. Then he drew the bow across the strings. The sound was rough at first, out of practice, but it was there. Tom stopped working and turned around. Silas looked up from the table. Eliza was at the stove, and she started laughing before the first full note finished. Not at him, at the sound of the house, which had a voice again. They worked on the lodge for 2 weeks, all 4 of them, each doing what they did well. Rowan on the structural repairs, Silas on the woodwork, the new frames, the rebuilt doorways, Tom on the horses, the supply runs, the fence line, Eliza on the supplies, the meals, the organizing, and the long back wall she measured and filled herself when Silas showed her how. They talked during it about the things people talk about when they're building something together. What goes where, what the space needs, what it doesn't, and about the other things. What each of them was afraid of. What they'd learned about themselves in the past weeks that they were still working through. Tom said one afternoon, while they were eating lunch on the porch, "I always figured the reason people left was something about me. Like there was a version of me that would have made them stay." He looked at his plate. "I'm starting to think it wasn't that." "It wasn't that," Silas said. Tom nodded slowly. "Yeah." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I built that treatment room off the back of the stable, for travelers caught in storms, people who need somewhere to go." He looked at the mountain, not at them. Clara would have liked that. Nobody rushed to agree or disagree. They just let it sit. Eliza opened the lodge to storm travelers in March, when 2 men got caught on the upper trail in a late blizzard and showed up at the door half frozen. She and Silas warmed them and fed them and sent them on their way the next morning with food for the road. Word got around. Mountain people talk. By spring, Silent Lodge had a small, quiet reputation, a place on the upper trail where you could get warm and get help, and nobody would make you feel like a burden for needing it. The night the last repairs finished, they sat around the fire, just the 4 of them, the way they had on the worst nights and the good ones too. Eliza looked at Rowan. "You let me say no on the first night. When Silas was treating my ankle and I was terrified, you explained everything first. You waited." She looked at Tom. "You brought laughter back into my life about 48 hours after I arrived, which I didn't know I needed." She looked at Silas. "You cared for me without once making me feel small for needing care." Rowan looked at her across the fire. "You walked into this house, and within 4 days, it was running better than it had in years." "The flour was damp," she said. "The flour was damp," he agreed. He almost smiled. Tom said, "I love you." "I'll keep saying it because I like saying true things," Silas said. "I love you, even though it still frightens me sometimes." Rowan said, "I love you, and I love these 2 men. That's not new information for any of us, but I apparently need practice saying it out loud." Eliza looked at all of them. "I love you," she said, separately and at the same time, which I didn't think was something a person could do until recently. Tom raised an eyebrow. "Recently? Don't push it," she said. He laughed. Silas stood and banked the fire for the night. Tom carried the cups to the kitchen. Rowan closed the front shutters. Eliza stood near the bedroom door. She looked at all 3 of them, and she thought about the first night, the snow and the pain and the terrifying relief of being warm in a stranger's house, and the question she'd asked herself lying on that cot with the bolt thrown on the door. "Can I trust this?" She had her answer now. "Do not hurry," she said. "This time, I want to choose every moment." Silas looked at her. "You're certain?" She smiled. "Yes, completely." The fire burned down slowly. The bedroom door closed. Outside snow was falling again, soft and steady, covering the new wood of the rebuilt back wall, the repaired fence, the stable where the horses were warm. Inside, There was laughter, quiet laughter, the kind that belongs to people who have found something real. In the morning, 4 cups stood on the table. Eliza made breakfast. Tom brought in firewood and dropped half of it, which he blamed on his shoulder, even though it had healed 2 weeks ago. Silas went to check the treatment room, walking through the fresh snow with his hands in his mop pockets and his shoulders easy. Rowan picked up the fiddle. He played the first note slowly, working the bow, finding the sound again. It wasn't perfect. The strings were. Eliza started to laugh. She laughed the way people laugh when something has been gone a long time and finally comes back all the way without holding any of it back. Silent Lodge was silent no longer, and so the storm passed. Not just the one that howled through the pines and buried the mountain under 2 feet of snow, but the deeper storm. The one Eliza had been riding through long before her horse lost its footing on the ice. She came to Silent Lodge with nothing but a broken ankle, a secret, and a man hunting her down the mountain. She left it, if you can call it leaving, when you've signed your name to the deed with something far harder to come by than an inheritance. She left it with people who had seen her at her worst and chosen to stay anyway. That's the first thing this story teaches us, and it's the one most of us forget when life gets cold and dangerous. Safety is not a place. It's a practice. Rowan didn't make Eliza safe by locking the door. He made her safe by telling her, on the very first night, that the lock on her bedroom door was hers to use or not use, her choice, not his. That one small act, giving a frightened woman control over a single door, was the beginning of everything. Because trust doesn't grow from grand gestures. It grows from 100 small moments where someone could have taken something from you and didn't. The second thing this story teaches us is about the kind of strength we've been told to admire and why it isn't always what it looks like. Rowan Hale is not a weak man. He carried grief for 3 years without setting it down. He stood between Eliza and danger without flinching. But his greatest failure was the same as his greatest instinct. He wanted to carry everything alone. He wanted to go down the mountain by himself, face Victor by himself, make every decision by himself, because somewhere inside him, he believed that protecting the people he loved meant removing every risk before they had to face it. And what Tom said to him at that supper table was the most important thing anyone said in the entire story. You did the same thing with your brother. Love that controls is not love. It's fear wearing love's clothes. Real protection means walking beside someone through the danger, not deciding they don't get to face it. The third thing, and this one is quiet, so you have to listen for, it is what Silas teaches us about grief. 11 years after losing his wife and daughter, Silas was still practicing how to care for people. He said it himself plainly, without apology. It's harder than it sounds, after something like that. He didn't pretend he was healed. He didn't perform recovery. He just kept showing up, cutting bandages, treating wounds, sitting beside people through the night. Because he had decided, in whatever dark and private way a person decides such things, that the answer to losing people was not to stop caring for them. It was to keep going. That's not a small thing. That might be the bravest thing in the whole story. And then there's Tom. Tom, who said I love you out loud because he was tired of not saying true things. Tom, who had spent his whole life expecting to be left the moment he stopped being useful, and who had to learn slowly, painfully, in a cold room with a bullet in his shoulder, that belonging to a family is not the same as earning your place in one. You don't earn it. You choose it, and it chooses you back. Eliza could have taken the northern trail. The horse was ready. The pack was on the table. The road was passable. Nobody would have blamed her. She had every reason in the world to ride toward her inheritance and her freedom and never look back at that half-burned lodge on the mountain. But she stayed, not out of debt, not out of fear, not because she felt she had no other option. She stayed because she wanted to, and she knew the difference. That distinction between staying because you're trapped and staying because you've chosen is everything. It's the whole story in a single moment. Silent Lodge started as a place of shelter. It ended as a home. And the difference between those two things is exactly what this story is really about. The difference between surviving the storm and building something that lasts after it. Four people with broken things inside them: grief, fear, loneliness, guilt didn't fix each other. They just showed up, consistently, with honesty and patience, and a willingness to say the hard, true things out loud until the broken things had company, and the house had four names on the deed, and the fiddle came down from the attic. That's what love looks like in the long winters. Not perfect, not painless, but real and chosen and warm enough to last. This story